On September 6, 2013, the Historical Museum opened the historical Missoula Mercantile building doors to First Friday revelers to host a presentation about mercantile history and exhibit photos and items from the Missoula Mercantile.
Hi. Hi, everybody. My name is Christina Swanson, and I'm the Development Director at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And we are the ones who are putting on this event for you tonight. And we want to thank our partners in this event, Octagon Partners, who own the building, Zill Estate, which is the real estate company that is working on selling this building. And if you're interested, find out. Big Sky Brewing Company provided us with some beer. And was probably going to run out of wine. You guys drank a lot of wine, so. And we do ask you to limit yourselves to one drink, and I'm sorry for that, but our hosts were concerned about, because you've noticed maybe the sort of uneven quality of the floor, there are some hazards in here, and our hosts didn't really want people to drink more than one drink, so. I can't even tell you how exciting it is to see so many people here. As you can tell from our chair situation, we didn't anticipate this many people, and I apologize that we don't have enough chairs for everybody. If you're a super able-bodied person who doesn't mind standing for an hour or so, if you want to give up your chair, if there's someone who might feel like they need a chair, I'll leave that up to you. You very kind and generous Missoulians to figure out amongst yourselves. But I really appreciate you being here. As you know, you're here to see a presentation about this very building, its origins, its relationship to the growth of Missoula. And our presenter is Minie Smith. She wrote the book. She literally wrote the book on the Missoula Mercantile. We do have the books for sale up front, so when the presentation's over, if you'd like to buy one of the books, you're welcome to do so. We may not have enough for everybody who wants to buy one, but you can get them at Fact and Fiction, and you can also get them at the Historical Museum at our bookstore. If you have, who's been out to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula in the last year? Good, oh, awesome, good. That's about half of you. So the other half, I'd like to encourage you to come out because we just have some really interesting exhibits right now of World War II propaganda posters. We have another exhibit of, it's called Signs of the Times, and it's historic Missoula business signs. We also have our beautiful grounds and 14 buildings with exhibits inside the buildings, so there's always lots to see there. We always have something new. We'd love for you to come out and visit us. And we're really happy to come downtown and visit you. So Minie Smith wrote the book, The Missoula Mercantile, the store that ran an empire. And Minie has degrees from Georgetown University and the University of Montana. And she's originally from the East Coast. And she didn't want me to say too much more than that. So I'm just going to give it up to Minie now, and thank you again for being here. Let me know if you have any questions. Because people with name tags on that look like mine, it says Historical Museum on it, they are the folks who are the experts on the museum and would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I've just put together a few slides about the history of the Missoula Mercantile, and I'm sure there are many of you here who have wonderful stories to tell, so I hope that you'll share them at the end of the presentation, if I can stop the... Anyway...
Keep going.
Okay.
I'm just gonna, if I move this up, it won't get feedback.
This is the building as it looked in the artist rendering that the Missoula Mercantile used for years and years. It all started in Hellgate Village, which you're all familiar with, which was about 3 miles west of here, and it was about, in 1860, this village was formed, and Warden and Higgins had the first store there. It was at the crossroads of the Mullen Road and the road down from the Flathead. So it was a busy place, and it was called a town that had 12 or more people, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how many people had gotten hung the week before. Anyway, but in 1861, gold was discovered in Bannock, and it just began to bring lots of people through, and they realized that there wasn't enough water for mills, for a sawmill or a flour mill. So they moved the town 3 miles to its present location, which was first called Missoula Mills, and then they just dropped the mills. And Higgins and Warden went on to build a store. This is, again, an artist rendering of what it might or might not have looked like. But they built a store on the corner of Main and Higgins. But that's jumping ahead of the story. Edward Bonner he came from the East Coast, and he'd worked at Lord & Taylor's and gotten some retail experience there. And he joined up with a man named Daniel Welch, and they figured out, excuse me, that the miners needed supplies, and so they started having pack trains to supply the mining camps. And you'll see they used it in their logo after a while. So their first store was called Bonner and Welch, and there's a invoice. A lot of these pictures and the material came from the archives at the university. They have a wonderful collection of things about the Merc. And also the museum, the historical museum, which you'll see later, some of the objects that they have. This is the first version of the Higgins Bridge. You might not recognize it. It looks a little wobbly, but the important thing was that you got a $25 fine for riding or driving faster than a walk, and a $100 fine if you took more than 10 cows. So Bonner and Welch continued their business, and they eventually built a little store on West Front. But then Welch decided he wanted to do something else for a while. He came back and had a grocery store later on, but this is when Richard Eddy got hooked into the business. And also, at about the same time, there was a man named A.B. Hammond who had wandered into Hellgate, and he'd worked for George White, who had a small store there. And then Mr. White died, and so Hammond stayed on and helped sort of keep things going. And then he had come originally from St. Leonard's in New Brunswick, and St. Leonard's is kind of up in that northern, you're looking at the state of Maine, and I don't know if I point there, whether no, that won't work. Anyway, it was a small little village, and he and his brother decided they all were in the lumber business, and he and his brother found that there wasn't enough, the lumber business was failing there, so people were moving west, and like all young men, they went west. So Hammond was hooked up with Eddy, who was now, it was Bonner and Eddy and Hammond. But the business was called Eddy and Hammond. Bonner kind of was more interested in running a store in Butte, so he stayed financially involved, but he didn't stay actively involved. So these are just some of the things. You would be surprised. This is 1883, and they were selling, sunshades and parasols. It's not quite what you'd expect to find in the Wild West, but at that time. And here's what Eddy and Hammond's store looked like. Again, an artist's rendition. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but And that was the logo with the, going back to the wagon, the train, the mule trains that they'd used. Now Hammond was an opportunist, and he realized that the railroad was coming through, and he thought that the way to catch on to, make lots of money was to catch on to the railroads, hook up with them. So the story is that he took the executives of the railroad up to Flathead Lake for the day, and when he came back, he had this first contract, which was to supply everything to build a railroad for between the Blackfoot River and Thompson Falls, and that was for clothing and food and railroad ties, which meant that they were going to cut a lot of timber. Now, much of the West was not surveyed at that time, but the railroads had been given every other section of land, but they weren't surveyed. So Hammond and his woods crews just went through and cut everything. They didn't. And they eventually were fined $10,000, but they'd cut millions of board feet of timber. So Hammond wasn't satisfied with just the first contract, and he got a second contract for 20 years supplying all this. And this is really how he could built up the Mercantile, and as you'll see, he built up other stores. So in 1885, they changed the name of the store and they incorporated it. It actually became the Missoula Mercantile. So that's the first time you see the name on it. And this is a later picture, but you can see them bringing in supplies with horses for the store. So Hammond decided, because he decided everything in this operation, that they needed someone to manage the store. And so he looked back to his relatives in New Brunswick, and there he found a man named Charles Herbert McLeod. And he was a young man, and he came west and to run the store, and he had an adventurous time. He came by train and by stage, and the story is that he spent the night in Drummond on the way here, and they told him to go sleep in this warehouse, and he noticed there was a man sleeping there. He thought, turns out the next morning the man was dead. He'd been stored in the warehouse. So anyway, that was his introduction to the West. But Hammond and McLeod got along very well, and but eventually Hammond left most of the day-to-day management of the store to McLeod. And these are just some of the first employees in 1885. And here's the early store. You can see that this front wall on, where are we, Higgins, over there, is all bricked up, and they used it for advertising. And there's some writing on the top of it, and it shows that they had offices of other businesses on the second floor of the building, one of which was another one of Hammond's enterprises, the big Blackfoot Mining and Manufacturing Company, which was the mill at Bonner. So Hammond the Merc became the umbrella for all Hammond's enterprises. And here's Hammond and his family. He married the sister of his former partner's Richard Eddy's wife. So one of the things about the Hammonds and the McLeods were that they were all sort of related by the time they'd gotten married, and so it was not only people that worked for him, but it was relatives who worked for him. So it added another layer of so this is an early picture of the plumbing department, which was down in the basement. And this was the early liquor department. It was, Hammond also started the First National Bank, which was across the street. And eventually he came to own all four corners of this so the bank was across the street, and he built an office building, the Hammond building, where the Hammond Arcade is now, and then the Florence Hotel he built too, as well. Anyway, the liquor store was first in the basement of the bank, which, and they had a retail grocery store, and there's the furniture department. These stores all had doors on Front Street, because Front Street was Mullen Road, so that was the important road, the important access. So they were all sort of narrow, as you can see in this building. There were narrow stores, and so you. I don't think they had connecting. I don't know whether they had connecting doors on the inside, but on the, you could get. Each department was different. And the Northern Pacific Railroad did promotional maps, and of course Hammond, because he owned so much of Missoula, got in on, so it's all his buildings that are along the bottom of here. This is the advertising map. Here's the carriage and buggy department. Again, you see that narrow store. But one of the other things that made the Missoula Mercantile successful was that they branched out to other towns, and they sold at the same price at these stores at Victor and Stevensville and Arley and St. Ignatius. They all of them sold at the same prices that were sold in the main store. So people didn't have to travel into Missoula to buy their goods. So this was the one at Victor. And this is a postcard just showing the four corners that he owned. But what's interesting in this picture is this was taken a couple of years before the Flathead Reservation was opened to white settlement. And there's an office there in that building, in Hammond's building, to get people to, because he wanted to get a lot of settlers in on the reservations to sort of build up his clientele there. So he was always thinking of the next. This is the one in St. Ignatius, and it was here existing until a few years ago, and then I think it burned. Yeah. Kalispell became the biggest one. It was at Damarisville. I think that's how you pronounce it. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so they had huge warehouses there. This was the office in Kalispell. And this is the Kalispell store, but many years later. And it still exists. It's not a department store or anything, but the building still exists. The Bonner Mill was, again, another one of Hammond's. This was the first, his first enterprise, because, of course, once he got the lumber contract, he needed a sawmill to saw the lumber. And this was, most of the mills at that time were temporary mills, and they moved from place to place. When they'd cut all the wood and then move the mill. But this was a permanent mill, and although it's not a working mill today, it still exists in Bonner. And this was the Margaret Hotel, which Hammond built in Bonner for guests of the mill and dignitaries who came. And unfortunately, that was torn down by the Anaconda Company in 1957, which is everybody's quite sad about. It was supposedly named after a teacher in Bonner, in the Bonner School, the first teacher, or one of the first teachers. But there's still debate about that. So he needed a similar hotel in Missoula, so he built the Florence Hotel, which opened in 1888. And that one burned for the first time in 1913. But he rebuilt it, and there were steam. They heated it with steam. They heated this building with steam, and because Hammond also owned the steam plant, And these buildings were connected underground by steam tunnels and also by tunnels that you could walk through. And we'll see later some of the guests did that. Anyway, this is the shoe department. And this was an early 1900 window display. And this was the hardware department. The hardware was down originally in the basement. Departments moved around, so they weren't always in the same place. And millinery, in case you needed a new hat. And farm implements were a big, something that they sold a lot of. And there's one of the, it's called a tiger horse rake. It seems like that was a fancy new rake. They tried to get the latest items and sell them. So they were managing more than a store. They were managing all these extra, stores in all the different towns, and they were also involved all over town. Hammond gave land to start the university. This is an early picture where there's after a few of the buildings had been built, but it was a long way from town, from the center of town. And this you probably can't see very well, but it shows a lot of the land that is designated, it either belongs to Hammond or to one of his land companies. So Hammond really had his fingers in a lot of the pies, such that his enemies called him the octopus, because he even owned the cemetery. So you couldn't even die in Missoula without having to pay something to Hammond. And these are, let's see, the top one isn't his building, but the others are his buildings. But he was not a gracious man, and people didn't like him. And Hammond, there was a Hammond Street in town, and it was renamed University after Hammond left in 1896. He sold the Bonner Mill, and he left he went to Oregon, and then went on to California. And in each of those states, he built up a lumber empire. He still kept tabs on what was going on here, but as I say, once he left town, people didn't like him, and they changed. You can go and see that today, where it's all filled in, and but they did like McLeod, and he really did a lot for the community, and he was really involved in the community, and people really liked him. And I'm hoping that Ty Robinson, who's here, who was the counsel for the Merc for many years, can tell us something about him, because he's the one who really built up the store, because I think he managed on a very, he had his fingers on everything, so he knew he'd go around each day and keep track of what was going on. And I don't know whether the employees liked that, but anyway, there's the basement. You can see all the hardware. This is one of the ads they had in 1910. You can get a new parlor if were so inclined. In about 1908, they redid the front door, because the focus was moving from Front Street around to Higgins. And they also, the big change in the building was when they put in the windows on the, remember the blank wall that was full of advertising? This now is all windows, and there, you can still, if you walk along, you can look up and see the awning. It's all, it's interesting how it's made to let light through. So it was a pretty fancy item. And again, this is the same drawing we'd seen in the beginning. They just continued to use it. It's the first one had horses in it, and then when horses disappeared, they put in streetcars and cars, and so it just kept the same. This was the farm implement store, which was in the Elks building, or the bottom floor of the Elks building. Hammond helped build that building. And this was the furniture and carpet annex that moved out of this side over to that side of the street. And there were a lot of warehouses in Missoula. Here's one. This one is still here today. It's over in back of St. Pat's. So you can see, and you can still see the painting on the top of it. It says the Missoula Mercantile. Now, I just stuck this in because they were very innovative at the store. And I think you'll see here today that they've brought a number of pieces of the things that they sold at the store here for you to look at. But probably not this because it's quite big. But people probably recognize this. Walter, Herbert's son, went to Chicago, and this was a brand new thing in 1927, and he came back and he said, "Oh, we got to get one for the store." It was you could look at it was an x-ray machine that you could look at your feet. And of course, in time, they realized that wasn't such a great idea to use. So they just stopped using it. But anyway, you can see it out at the museum at the fort when you go. Most of the deliveries were made at first by horse and buggy, and then by a truck. And they had a whole garage of maintaining the trucks. And here's the hardware department again. I'm not sure if they brought over the catalog of the Merc hardware department, but it was something that was maybe this deep, full of 600 or 800 pages of things that you could get at the Merc. And if you came in and asked for something and they didn't have it, they would order it for you. With the result that they ended up with a huge inventory because often they didn't order just what you wanted, they ordered an extra one. And in time they had lots of extra ones left over. There was a glassware department. And here's the McLeod family. You see, there were quite a lot of them by the time this picture was taken. And this is the office, which was on the second floor. Everything happened on Higgins now. All the parades went by, and so the Merc was right in the center of everything. And they often had a float in the parades. They made postcards of the store to have available. And the trolley car ran by. The trolley that went out to Bonner stopped at the Merc, and they had a special bench there for people waiting for the Bonner trolley. And the Bonner trolley is now out at the fort, so you can see it out there. It's been restored, and it's beautiful. About 1925, it was painted white. I'm not quite sure why, but it was, and it remained that color for a number of years. And then in 1936, the Florence burned again. And Charles McLeod, they boarded up or covered over the windows of the Merc to keep the ash out. But C.H. McLeod was determined not to have an empty, burned-out building across the street from the Mercantile. And so he got all the businesses in town. He went up and down the street. He took Walter with him and said, okay, we're going to go get all these businesses to contribute and be part of rebuilding the Florence. And that's what they did. And so this was the gala dinner that they had to celebrate that. And if you go in the Florence today, there's a plaque on the wall to him for his efforts. Christmas was a big time at the Merc. I'm sure people will have stories of Christmas because I heard quite a few just in researching the book. And They had a train that went the length of the store, or at least length of part of the store. Not having been here, I don't know quite how far it went. And this was another parade back in 1933. You can see the original logo of the train, the mule train. It continued to be. And I put this in because about the end of the late 30s and early 40s, the Merc got into the grain business, and it was a huge business. And they had these mills and grain elevators all over Great Falls, and I guess that was as far as they went, but they were huge. And Ty can tell you about what happened to the grain elevators. Anyway, this is the only one that's remaining and it's in Bozeman, and they've made it into a gallery. And that was just a postcard that they had from it. But I wanted to mention this was just an example of the things that the Merc got involved in. The Lutherans came to Missoula in 1957, and they had a huge convention. I mean, there were thousands here, and the Merc, you can see there's a big white cross on the side of the Merc, and they had a parade, and they were involved once again. And there's a store in the 40s. Now, Herbert McLeod was still running the Merc into the 40s, and Walter by then was probably in his 40s, and he was would have been getting anxious that, he never was going to actually get to run the store, but because his father sort of had a tight rein on his what he did. But Walter got to take over in the late 40s because Charles resigned. Here's the newer version of the furniture department, which was across the street, and another later window display. And you remember I mentioned the tunnels. Well, prominent guests would stay at the Florence, and they'd want to come shopping at the Merc without having people bother the hoi polloi bother them. So they would come over after hours, and Walter or one of the people would take them around the store after hours. And this is Gary Cooper. They said there's a little door downstairs in the basement that supposedly was used for that purpose. Now these are Walter's employees. And Walter had a different problem because by the time he got to take charge of the store, there were chain stores were beginning to compete with the department stores, and it was harder for the Merc to continue in the way it had done business before. They did a big renovation in the 50s to try and make the store competitive. There's a shoe department, and the bridal department was apparently was known all over western Montana and into Spokane, and people would come long distances to get their bridal gowns. And there's the sporting goods department, and they also had pretty much from the beginning, they had a small grocery store, but again, in the 50s, it became this hostess shop. They updated it, and but eventually, they were not able to manage to keep everything going, and they were saddled with big buildings and this huge inventory, and so what they did was take the hardware department and the Kalispell store, and they formed the Montana Mercantile. And that was where Conlon's was. I'm not sure what's there now. It's that
radio stations.
Radio station? Yeah, thank you.
And one furniture.
But that was an attempt. And at this building, they had the state-of-the-art freight dock where they could bring the railroad cars right in, and this would hold 7 freight cars at a time, so they could fill them up. It was a huge business. So, but eventually the store was sold, and it was first sold to the Bon Marché stores out of Seattle. And then they went through various degrees of reorganization. And you can see what happened. They wanted more floor space on the second floor, so they blocked up a lot of the windows. And one of the things that Octagon has done in restoring this building was unblock the windows and replace them with glass, which is, and then it became the Bon Marché. Oops, sorry. Wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of here. And then, of course, it became Macy's. And there was just an inside shot of Macy's. And then the store was, you know, we will remember it was empty for about a year and a half until the Octagon company out of Virginia bought it with hopes of restoring it and to its historic condition. And they did a lot of research and decided to return it to 1935. And that's why they unblocked those windows, and there were hanging what do you call mezzanines on here, and they took those out because those came in later. But these are just some pictures of the empty store because it looked so different than one that was full of merchandise. And I'll show you some pictures of the basement because I gather that we can't go down in the basement because of the condition of the floors. These are the original walls. When they added on to the store several times, but each time they just added another piece. And so the piece before is still there. And what was interesting, if you look downstairs, there's about 5 staircases because every time they added a new bit, they added a new staircase. And this is interesting because they used to sell rope. And you can see they measured it around the post, and the post is all worn. Here's one of the many staircases. Up on the second floor, they used lots of ways to get lighting from the roof down through the floor, and the floor is all these glass bricks you probably remember those. And this was the stairway to the top floor, which in later years was used for storing mannequins and things like that. I don't know, but it did go out to the roof. And there's a tin ceiling. There are some of these rooms, if you look up, still have the tin ceilings. Now, this was a big deal. One of the posts downstairs advertises the Ringling Brothers circus. It came in 1908, I think it was. And supposedly they kept some of the animals in the basement, and used them to get in and out. They used the freight elevator, but that's an unsubstantiated story. And there's some of the dates that people worked. They just wrote those dates on the columns. And that's and then to find out more, there's more in the book. Anyway, what I was hoping today was that people would share some stories, especially Ty, because that was what was exciting, was hearing the stories that people remembered, what they remembered about coming to the Mercantile. And would you say some? That would be. Maybe you'll tell
Thank you, Minie. I think you've unfolded a very interesting story. I came late to the Missoula Mercantile Company in 1948, but you mentioned the fact that they had control of everything, including cemeteries. Yes, they did. First 3 or 4 days I was there, my office was just outside of the president's office. I noticed a couple county commissioners came in the morning. Later in the afternoon came the chief of police. A couple days later came the chairman for the Republican Central Committee. Then about 3 days later came the Democratic chairman. What's going on? It's control, and they had that control so perfectly. Well, about the third or fourth day I'm here, the controller takes me around to show me what's new, what I should know about. We went to the basement, and there are 13,000 pair of horseshoes. I said, what do we do? Why do we have so many horseshoes? Well, he said, we have the Forest Service, and you can never tell when they have mules and horses. We take care of them. That wasn't too bad. After World War I, it seems that the Merc bought a lot of buggy whips. Yes, had 5,000 of them. My employer, the vice president, told me, he said, one day a man came into his office. He said, Ty, take him downstairs and see if he'll buy those buggy whips. He was a little man from Portland. And my boss said, try to get 25 cents a whip. We got down there and this fellow looked at him. He picked up one and snapped it, picked up another. Of course, they were all gone since 1918. That's quite a while to have those lay down and dry out. He said, I'll tell you, I'll give you 2 cents a whip. So I went to the phone and called my boss and I said, he won't give us anything. He said, try and get a dime. We ended up selling them to him at 3 cents a piece. One thing that Minie has told you about being an octopus, with all of these present organizations that they had, several were interesting. You mentioned the one building the railroad, where he went out and what we call in legal phrase, purloined, which means he stole the timber off from our land to build the railroad, and he kept on doing it. In 1985, 86, the United States government said, Mr. Hammond, you owe us $2.5 million for timber. Didn't bother him. As Minie said, he went on to Portland, did the same thing, went on down to California and did much the same. But in 1917, the government got around to take care of that debt. I'm not sure what to do the same thing today. They settled for the $10,000. So the Merc was in control up until 1950-55. As Minie said, the box stores, the competition moved in. Things then had to be changed. And I was on the dissolving part of the Merc up until 1977. Many things had to be sold. The banks, land, didn't matter whatever they owned. But these grain elevators you talked about, I'm a naive young lawyer that knows nothing about a grain elevator. But anyway, I went across the state to each grain elevator and found people interested. Before I left, I was informed we should at least get 50 cents on the dollar because they were so old. The people I'm dealing with know all about elevators, and I ended up after 2 weeks of selling elevators anywhere from 15 to 20 cents on the dollar and thought I was a hero. There are many stories that could be told about the Merc.
Oh, tell them about the safe, how much you found in the...
That was the fourth day that I was here. The controller took me around and he said, and the safe in this store is on the second floor, and many of you that have been in there have looked right into it. In recent years, when you bought a gift up there for a wedding or any occasion, you went over to have it wrapped, and as you did, you stood at the counter and looked right into the safe. Well, this morning, the controller took me into the safe and looked around and he said, I want you to know that we have a little over $10 million laying here in the safe. $10 million? Holy smokes. Well, I learned to live with that because the Missoula Mercantile Company was the Federal Reserve for Western Montana in those days. The president of the bank across the street might come by Friday afternoon, payday. They've run out of money. Comes over, we'll give him $500,000, $750,000 and a couple of sacks. Oftentimes he'd ask me if I'd walk back with him to the bank. Same thing happened up in the Western Bank. We'd fill up big bags for them, then we'd get somebody to help them haul it back. Middle of the afternoon, going up the street with that much money, I don't think we do it today. Minie, there are so many different stories we could tell. I want to end by one. C.H. McLeod had a son, Walter, as you indicated. When Walter took over, things were tough. But he was a wonderful, wonderful man, and which made the Missoula Mercantile Company a family. And why do I say a family? Well, the wages weren't very much, but at the end of the year, they were paid a bonus. And they acted as a family. A part of that family was in the hardware, right where you're sitting. They had 5 clerks. They had one by the name of Tweeton, whose son is sitting here, and another, and a lady. All right, 5 clerks. 3 of them are standing around telling jokes to each other. The other 2 were working. You come in to buy paint. That wall over there was loaded with paint, but you had to go up a ladder, and the ladder moved likewise. Nobody would go up that ladder except this lovely lady. I want to tell you one thing. That's the first time I ever saw a woman in pants.
Does anyone else have any stories of the Merc that they'd like to share? I'm sure that. Well, if not, I think we're going to have able to tour around a little bit of the building and see some exhibits in the room through there. So enjoy the Merc, and thank you for coming.
In 2011, the Merc building was purchased by Octagon Partners, a Virginia-based developer. The building is for lease as mixed-use commercial and office space, with offices on the second level and retail and services on the street level. The Merc building has been remodeled several times. The developers brought the building back to its original state and uncovered many fine historic assets, including windows, moldings, and pressed tin ceilings. The building is ready to be updated to conform to multiple modern uses. Octagon Partners and the Missoula community are working to once again make the Missoula Mercantile building a thriving downtown hub of commercial and civic life. For information about leasing space in the Merc building, contact Jed Dennison at Zilla State, 406-552-0466.